Book 7. Behold the Argonauts ploughing the sea on their voyage from Greece. Behind them was Thrace, where they'd seen King Phineus, blind and impoverished, passing a bleak old age, and Boreas's twins had routed the Harpies, who'd tortured that wretched old man by snatching his food. After many adventures under their captain, Jason, they finally came to the muddy stream of the swift-flowing Phasis. On reaching Aeetes' palace, they laid their claim to the Golden Fleece, and the king dictated his terms to the heroes, a series of hard and dangerous tasks. Meanwhile, his daughter Medea fell deeply in love with the handsome Jason. Despite a long struggle against her feelings, her reason was powerless to master her passion. "It's useless to fight, Medea," she said. "Some god is against you. This, or something akin to it, surely, is what they call love. How else should I find my father's conditions excessively harsh? For certain they are too harsh. How else should I fear for the life of a man I have only just seen? But why should I feel so afraid? How wretched I am! I must extinguish the fire which is raging inside my innocent heart. I should be more sane if I could. I am dragged along by a strange new force. Desire and reason are pulling in different directions. I see the right way and approve it, but follow the wrong. I am royal, so why should I sigh for a stranger, or ever conceive of a marriage which takes me away from my home? Love can be found here too. It rests in the lap of the gods, whether Jason survives or is killed. But I want him to live. I don't have to love him to pray for that. What crime has Jason committed? Only a cruel and heartless person could fail to be struck by his youthfulness, breeding, and courage. And who could be blind to his handsome looks if he lacked all else? My heart, at least, has been stirred. But unless I assist him, those fire-breathing bulls will blast him to ashes. The warriors sprung from the seeds which he sows in the earth will fight and destroy him, or else the greedy dragon will make him its prey. If I can allow this, I'll confess that I'm born of a tigress, confess that my heart is composed of nothing but rock and steel. Oh, why don't I watch him dying and so infect my eyes with the taint of the spectacle? Why don't I shout to the fire-breathing bulls, or the earth-born brutes, or the sleepless dragon to charge and attack him? Oh, heavens, grant me better than that. Yet better is not to be idly prayed for but done. By me, it is truly better that I should betray my king and my father, that some tall stranger should owe his life to my kind assistance, only to thank me, the woman who saved him, by spreading his sails to the wind without me, marrying someone else and leaving Medea to be punished. If he can do such a thing and prefer a rival to me, the ungrateful traitor can die. Yet when I think of that face, of that noble, heroic soul, of that strong and beautiful body, I cannot fear he'd be false or forget my help. To make certain, he'll give me his word in advance, and I'll force him to swear to our pact in the name of the gods. All's safe, there is nothing to fear. So be done with delay and to action. Jason will always be in my debt. The rites of the wedding torch will unite us. In all the cities of Greece, great throngs of women will praise me for saving their sons. What now? Shall I sail away on the wind and abandon my father, my brother, my sister, the gods and soil of my native country? Why shouldn't I leave a heartless father, a barbarous land, and a brother who's only a child? My sister's prayers go with me. The greatest of gods is alive inside me. I'll not forsake greatness, but rather pursue it. The glory of saving the sons of Greece, the knowledge of better lands and of cities with arts and civilized customs, whose fame is proclaimed in climes as distant as this. And lastly, my Jason, the man for whom I would gladly surrender all the treasures of earth. When I am his wife, they will call me happy, beloved of the gods, and I'll rise to the stars in my glory. What of those mountainous rocks that are rumored to clash in the ocean? What of Charybdis, who threatens the ships by swallowing up the waves, then spewing them forth? And what of the ravening Scylla, whose girdle of savage dogs barks over the sea of Sicily? Clinging to what I love, held tightly to Jason's breast, I can brave any voyage, however long. With him in my arms, I'll be frightened of nothing, or else my fears will be all for my husband. Your husband? Be careful, Medea. Are you using respectable words to cover your evil designs? No, no. Face up to the terrible wrong you're about to commit, and recoil from the guilt while you may. She ended. Now virtue, daughterly feeling, and maidenly conscience had come to the fore. Desire, now vanquished, was in retreat. Medea then made her way to the ancient altar of Hecate, goddess of spells, far off in the depths of a shadowy grove. Her purpose was firmly set, and the flame of her love had subsided, when Jason appeared on the scene, and the fire which had died was rekindled. A blush came over her cheeks, and the whole of her face glowed hot. As a tiny spark that is hidden under a pile of ashes is fanned and fed once again by the wind and grows to recover its earlier strength, so the love you might have supposed was dwindling and dying away flared up when she saw young Jason before her. That shining morning it chanced that the son of Aeson was looking more handsome than ever. Medea could hardly be blamed for her passion. Her gazing eyes were fixed on his face, as though she had never seen it before. It must be a god who is standing there, she thought in her madness, unable to turn her body away. But when the stranger began to speak, and suddenly gripping her right hand, begged in the humblest of tones for her help and promised to make her his wife, Medea burst into tears and replied, I see what I'm doing. So if I am cheated, I cannot blame ignorance, only my love. You shall owe your life to the help that I give you. Be sure that you keep your promise. He swore by the rights of the threefold goddess and all the power which haunted that sacred wood. He swore by his future father's father, the all-seeing sun god, by all the successes he hoped for and all the dangers he feared. Medea believed him. At once she gave him some magical herbs, then explained how to use them, and Jason returned to his tents with a light heart. The next day's dawn had driven the glittering stars from the sky. By the sacred field of Mars the people of Colchis were gathered, and standing to watch on the hills, enthroned in their midst King Aeetes, garbed in his purple robe and wielding an ivory scepter. There were the bronze-hooved bulls. They were breathing fire from their steely nostrils and scorching the grass on the plain with the force of their hot breath. Loudly they roared like a blacksmith's furnace filled to the full, or the sizzling sound of the molten stone from a builder's lime kiln igniting when sprinkled with running water. A noise as tremendous came from the chests of the bulls, while the flames rolled round in the prison inside them and then poured forth from their burning throats. But Jason calmly went forward to face them. The great beasts angrily turned their ferocious heads to meet his advance and leveled their iron-tipped horns. They pounded the dusty earth with their cloven hooves and vomited clouds of smoke as they filled the air with their bellowing. The Argonaut sailors were rigid with terror, but Jason approached, not feeling the fiery blasts, so potent the herbs that preserved him. He daringly stroked the bulls with his hand on their pendulous dewlaps, then placing a yoke on their necks, he forced them to draw the heavy weight of a plow and cut a path through a virgin plain. The Colchians watched in amazement, while all the Argonauts cheered and encouraged their captain, who took the teeth of the Theban dragon out of a golden helmet and scattered them into the furrow. These seeds, being steeped in a virulent poison, softened the earth, and the sown teeth started to grow and assume a new kind of body. Just as a baby takes human shape in its mother's womb, and the different parts are arranged inside to compose one whole, which doesn't emerge in the outside world till it's fully developed, so when the ripened form of a man was complete in the womb of the pregnant earth, he rose from the fertile soil to the surface, and, even more wonderful, clashed the weapons which came up with him. Seeing these warriors aiming to cast their sharp-pointed spears at Jason's head, his companions lowered their eyes in dismay. Even Medea, who'd made him safe, was quaking with fear. As she watched that army advancing towards their solitary target, her face turned suddenly pale, and she sat in a frozen trance. In case the herb she had given him proved too feeble, she chanted a spell for his extra support and called on her secret devices. Jason then hurled a gigantic rock right into the midst of his foes and repelled their attack by making them fight with each other. The earth-born soldiers died of the wounds they received from their brothers, as though they had fallen in civil war. With cheers of rejoicing, the Greeks swarmed round the victorious hero and hugged him tightly. The princess of Colchis would also have liked to embrace the victor, but modesty would not permit it. She merely exulted in silence and offered thanks for her spells to the gods of her magical powers. Jason's remaining task was to use Medea's herbs to drug the unsleeping dragon, who guarded the golden tree in the pride of its towering crest, its three-forked tongue, and its hooked fangs. After he'd sprinkled the monster with juice from a herb from the lethe, repeating a spell 3 times to induce a motionless slumber, a spell which could calm a troubled sea or a river in spate, sleep finally settled on eyes which had never known it, and Jason was able to capture the golden fleece. Then, proud in his spoil, and bearing a further prize in the woman who'd helped him to win it, the hero returned with his bride to Aeolus' harbor in triumph. In Thessaly, mothers and aged fathers brought gifts to the gods in thanks for their son's return. The altars were laden with incense, which melted over the flames. The promised victim with gilded horns fell under the axe. But Aeson, the father of Jason, could play no part in the general rejoicing. The tired old man was nearing the end of his life. His son then said to Medea, "I grant, dear wife, that you've saved me from death. You have given me all, and the sum of your many kindnesses truly passes belief. Yet I ask, if your magical powers can do it, and what can they not? Subtract a few of my years and add to the years of my father." He couldn't restrain his tears. Medea was moved by the loyal devotion which prompted this plea, and remembered the father she'd falsely betrayed and abandoned. Without confessing these feelings, she answered, "Dear husband, how could you suggest such a crime? Do you truly think that I could ever transfer a part of your life to another? Hecate wouldn't allow it, and you should never have asked. But still, my Jason, I'll try to do you an even greater favor than what you are begging. I'll use my arts to prolong your father's years without lessening yours, if only the three-formed goddess will help and support this daring attempt with her presence." 3 nights had still to go by before the horns of the moon could meet in a perfect orb. When it shone at last in its fullness, and gazed on the earth below with all its glory restored, Medea stole out of the palace. Her robes hung loosely about her, her feet were unshod, and her unbound hair flowed over her shoulders. All on her own, in the deadly stillness of deep midnight, she followed her wandering path. Other people, the birds and the beasts, were softly buried in sleep. Not a sow could be heard in the hedgerows. The leaves were silent and still, silent the dank air, motionless all but the twinkling stars. Extending her arms to the spheres, she turned full about 3 times. 3 times she sprinkled her head with water drawn from the stream. 3 times she opened her lips to utter a piercing cry. Then, kneeling down on the hard earth, prayed, "O night, most faithful keeper of secrets, you golden stars who companion the moon in succeeding the fires of the day. Hecate, three-formed goddess, who knows of my deep designs, and comes when invoked to assist the spells of skillful magicians. Earth, who yields all enchanters the potent herbs for their witchcraft. Breezes and winds of the air, you mountains, rivers, and lakes, gods of the forest and gods of the night, be here with me all. By your aid, whenever I will, to the bank's amazement, the rivers return there to their fountainheads. By your aid, I can quieten the troubled seas, or ruffle their calm with my spells. By your aid, I can banish the clouds, or cause them to gather. I summon and scatter the winds. With my incantations, I force fangled serpents to split their skins. I dislodge the rocks and uproot the trees, shift forests and order the mountains to tremble, the earth to rumble and spirits to rise from their graves. I can draw the moon from the sky, no matter how loudly the cymbals may clash to avert it. The sun, my grandfather's chariot, pales at my song, and my poisons can rob the dawn of her color. At my request, you deities blunted the force of the fire-breathing bulls and bowed their heads underneath the weight of the hooked plow. You forced the brood of the dragon's teeth to savage each other, and after you closed the eyes of the sleeplessly vigilant serpent who guarded the gold, you stole it away and restored it to Greece. Now I have need of the juices to make an old man in his weakness recover his youthful strength and return to the bloom of his prime. You will grant them, I know. The stars are not twinkling so brightly in vain, and it must be at your command that my chariot, drawn by winged dragons, is ready to take me. And there stood her car, sent down from the sky. As soon as she'd mounted and stroked the bridled necks of her serpents, she gave a shake to the slender reins and was swept to the sky, from where she looked down on Thessalian Tempe and steered her dragons to places she knew would provide her with herbs, Mount Ossa and Pelion, Othrys, Pendus, Olympus, the highest mountain of all, were crossed and explored. When she found what she wanted, she either plucked it up by the roots or cut it away with a curved bronze sickle. Much that she needed could also be found on the banks of the river Apidanus, or the Amphrysus, or else by the streams of Enopeus, Peneus, the waves of Spercheius, the reedy shores of Lake Bobe, all contributed plants, and Medea discovered a special grass for long life in Boeotian Anthedon facing Euboea, a city later renowned for the transformation of Glaucus. 9 days, 9 nights went by, as drawn by her team of winged dragons, she roamed the whole of the region to gather those herbs of renewal. And then she returned. The dragons had only inhaled the scent of the plants, but their skins were old with the years, and they sloughed them off. On reaching the palace, she halted outside the doors in the threshold, with only the sky to cover her head, and avoiding her husband's embraces to keep herself pure, she built 2 altars of green turf, one on the right to Hecate, one on the left to the goddess of youth. When she'd twined these round with branches and leaves from the woodland, she dug 2 pits in the earth close by and started her ritual sacrifice. First she plunged her knife in the throat of a black-fleeced victim, whose blood was allowed to flow in the open trenches. Then, as she tipped a bowl of honey to add to the liquid, followed in turn by a chalice of milk still warm from the udder, she chanted her incantation and called on the spirits of earth, together with Pluto, the king of the shades, and his stolen consort, to wait before they purloined the life in the old man's body. Now that she'd soothed these gods with her long, low-muttered petitions, she ordered the servants to carry the feeble body of Aeson outside. Then, intoning a spell till sleep had fully relaxed him, she laid him out, as though he were dead, on a bed of herbs. The old king's son and attendants were ordered to stand far off and not to look with unhallowed eyes on her secret mysteries. All dispersed as she bade. With hair flowing loose like a bacchant, Medea encircled the blazing altars. She dipped 2 split-wood torches into the trench, and once they were steeped in the sheep's black blood, she set them alight at her altars and purified Aeson thrice with this fire, thrice with water, and thrice with sulfur. Meanwhile, in the brazen pot on its stand, the potent elixir was boiling, bubbling and frothing white in the rising foam. The brew consisted of roots which Medea had cut in Thessalian valleys with corn seed, flowers and juices as black as pitch, strange stones she had fetched from the farthest east, and sand that the ocean had washed in an ebbing tide. She had added some hoarfrost gathered by blazing moonlight, the wings and the flesh of an ominous screech owl, guts of a wolf with the power of changing its bestial features to those of a man, the scaly skin of a water snake caught in a Libyan stream, the liver drawn from a long-lived stag, with the eggs and head of a crow that had chattered for 9 generations. With these and 1,000 nameless objects, the Colchian witch was ready to work her spell transcending the powers of a mortal. Dipping the branch of an olive, once fruitful but long since withered, she stirred the ingredients up and mingled the top with the bottom. And look, the dry stick circling around in the boiling cauldron changed, to start with from gray to green, and then in a short while sprouted with leaves and was suddenly laden with fat, ripe olives. Whenever the foam on the fire spilt over the side of the vessel and hot drops fell to the ground, the soil turned green and a cluster of flowers arose on the soft, lush grass. As soon as she saw this, Medea unsheathed her sword and drew a cut in the old man's throat, so letting the blood drain out of his body. She then replaced it with juice from the pot. When Aeson had fully absorbed this, either by mouth or by way of the wound, his hair and his beard lost all of their whiteness and quickly returned to a lustrous black. His leanness, pallor, and withered features had all disappeared. Those wrinkled and creased old cheeks filled out with their firm new flesh. His limbs grew supple and strong. In utter amazement and wonder, Aeson remembered himself in his young days 40 years earlier. From his home in the sky, Dionysus had watched Medea perform this astonishing miracle. Seeing his nurses could still be restored to the years of their youth, he obtained this boon from the woman of Colchis. Black treachery next. Medea, pretending that she and Jason were now estranged, took refuge in Pelias's house to implore protection. The king himself was enfeebled by age, but his daughters welcomed her gladly. In no time at all, their Colchian guest had cunningly won their hearts by a show of counterfeit friendship. Among her signal achievements, Medea was careful to cite the rejuvenation of Aeson, and dwelt at some length on the details, so planting the hope in the gullible daughters' minds that their father could also recover the bloom of his youth with similar treatment. This they requested, and told her to name any price that she chose. Medea was quiet for a while, as though she were still undecided, keeping them all in suspense while she seemed to be mulling it over. Then, when she'd promised to help them, she said, "To prove that I really can do what I say, I shall use the power of my magic herbs to change the oldest tup in your flocks to a newborn lamb." At once the daughters brought forward a sheep, a clapped-out creature of years untold, with its horns all twisted around its forehead. Medea then thrust her Thessalian knife in its scraggy old throat, the metal was hardly stained, as the blood was so thin, and plunged the carcass into the cauldron containing her potent mixture. The ram's frame shrunk, and its ears burned up along with its horns. Then a feeble bleating was heard right down in the depths of the cauldron, and while they were all still frozen in wonder, a lamb jumped out and friskily scampered away in search of an udder to suck. Pelias's daughters were quite dumbfounded, and now that Medea's claims were confirmed, they pressed their demand with greater insistence. 3 times the sun god had plunged his steeds in the streams of the Ebro and lifted their yokes. The 4th night came, and the radiant stars were glittering bright, when the treacherous visitor kindled a raging fire underneath a cauldron she'd only filled with plain water and herbs which had no effect. The king and his guards beside him were all relaxed in a death-like sleep, induced by the magical power of the sorceress's tongue, as she chanted her incantations. Medea had ordered the daughters to join her inside the palace. When all were standing around the bed, she attacked them. "Cowards, why are you shrinking now? Unsheath those swords and empty his aged veins, so that I may refill them with youthful blood. Your father's life and his years are now dependent on you. If you have any daughterly love, and your hopes are not wishful thinking, then show your father the duty you owe him and use your weapons to purge his old age. Release his blood with the points of your swords." Lashed on by these taunts, the child whose sense of duty was strongest was first to betray it, avoiding guilt by committing a crime. And so with the others, but none could look at the wounds they were dealing. With eyes averted, they blindly, wildly stabbed at their father. Dripping with blood, he still was able to lift himself up on his elbow. Though covered with gashes, he tried to get up from his couch, and braving the circle of sword points around him, extended his pale arms. "What are you doing, my children?" he cried. "Who gave you these weapons to murder your father?" Their courage failed, and they lowered their swords. He would have said more, but his words were cut off by Medea, who knifed his throat and plunged his butchered limbs in the boiling water. If she hadn't been borne to the sky on the wings of her dragon chariot, Medea would surely have paid for her crime. Her flight through the air took her over the woods of Mount Pelion, home of Chiron the centaur, then over Othrys, and pastures renowned for the tale of Cerambus. When Earth's huge mass was submerged beneath the tide of the ocean, Cerambus was lifted on wings to the sky with the help of the nymphs, and so escaped Deucalion's flood, and was rescued from drowning. Next, on her left, she passed the Aeolian city of Pitani, facing the great long petrified snake on the shore of Lesbos, and Ida's forests, where Bacchus protected his thieving son by hiding a stolen bullock within the form of a stag. She passed where Paris was modestly buried in shallow sand, where Maera, transformed to a dog, once startled the fields with her barking. Eurypylus' city and coasts, where the women were changed into cows at the time when Hercules' army was journeying home from the Troad. Phoebus' roads in the town of Ialissos, where the Telchines, magicians whose evil eye could destroy whatever they gazed on, were drowned in the waves of the sea by Jupiter's powerful hatred. She also traversed the walls of Carthea on ancient Chios, where old Alcidamas, later in time, would be greatly surprised when a peaceful dove sprang out of the corpse of his daughter Tassila. Medea looked down on Hyrie's lake in the beautiful valley, renowned for a boy called Cycnus, who suddenly changed to a swan. This was the story. On Cycnus' orders, his lover Pelias captured some vultures and slaughtered a lion, which he brought to his friend. When also commanded to tame a wild bull, he had done so, but angry because his love had been spurned so often, he wouldn't hand over this final prize. In a fury, the boy cried out, "You'll be sorry for this," and jumped off a cliff. While everyone thought he had fallen, in fact he'd been changed to a swan and was gliding on snow-white wings. His mother Hyrie, though, unaware that her son had been rescued, dissolved in her tears and gave her name to the pool she created. Close by is Aetolian Pleuron, where Ophius' daughter Combe escaped on fluttering wings from a savage attack by her children. Next, Medea set eyes on Caloria, Leto's island, which witnessed the change of the king and his wife to a pair of birds. There to the right was Mount Cyllene, the place where Minophron was destined to sleep in shame with his mother, as though they were wild beasts. Far in the distance, behind the river Cephalus, was the river Cephalus bemoaning the fate of his grandson, changed to a plump wet seal by Apollo. And there the house of Eumelus, who grieved for his wing-born son. At last Medea arrived in her dragon car at Pyrenean Corinth. Here, in the earliest times, according to an ancient tradition, our bodies grew from the rain-fed mushroom. But after Jason's new bride had blazed in the poison robe, and fire in the royal house had been watched each side of the isthmus, the wicked Medea then steeped her sword in the blood of her children. Proud in this evil revenge, the mother escaped from the father's wrath. She was swept to the sky by her dragons, until she entered the fortress of Pallas at Athens, where Phene, most righteous of women, and aged Periphas soared together as vulture and eagle. Alcyone, too, could be seen, borne up on her kingfisher wings. King Aegeus welcomed Medea, itself enough to condemn him, but more was offered than shelter. He also made her his wife. Now Theseus, whose father Aegeus had never known him, arrived. His heroic deeds had established peace on the isthmus of Corinth. Bent on his murder, Medea prepared him a potion of aconite, brought by her earlier over the sea from the Scythian shores. The poison is said to have come from the teeth of the monstrous dog whom Echidna bore. Imagine a cave with a murky entrance, inside it a sloping path up which the hero from Tyrann's, Hercules, dragged along Cerberus, fastened in steel link chains. Persistently stopping, the dog kept blinking and turning his eyes away from the dazzling light of the sun. In a frenzy of anger, he filled the air with his barking from all three heads at the same time, sprinkling the green of the fields with the white of the foam from his mouth. The foam is supposed to have then congealed. It was fertilized by the rich, rank soil and acquired the power of a deadly poison. Seeing this new plant grows and thrives on a hard rock bed, our peasant folk call it aconite, based on the Greek for a whetstone. Such was the potion Medea had craftily given to Aegeus, Theseus's father, to offer the son whom he thought was an enemy. Theseus, suspecting nothing, had taken the cup in his hand, when the old king spotted the family emblem engraved on the ivory hilt of the young man's sword, and dashed the brew from his lips. Though Theseus's father was filled with joy that his son was safe, he was also filled with horror that such a terrible crime had been so closely prevented. He kindled the fires on his altars and lavishly plied the gods with his gifts. The ritual axes struck on the muscular necks of the bulls with their ribboned horns. No day of rejoicing, they say, ever dawned in the city of Athens more hallowed than this one. Elders and humbler folk celebrated at banquets together and sang their songs as the wine inspired them. All praise to you, Theseus, greatest of heroes. The people in Marathon's plain were amazed when you slaughtered the dangerous Cretan bull. It is thanks to you that the farmers of Crommyon plow their fields, unafraid of the monstrous boar, that fair Epidaurus was rescued when vile Periphetes, who carried the club, was struck to the earth, that ruthless Procrustes was also destroyed on the banks of Cephalus, that Ceres' city Eleusis was witness to Cercyon's downfall. You also disposed of the giant Citnus, that mighty abuser of strength, who would bend two pines and lower their tops to the ground, then release them and scatter his victims' fragments over the land. No Skyron to haunt it, the path to the Leleges city of Megara now lies open and safe. The robbers' bones have been scattered. But neither on land nor on sea have they found any resting place. Long tossed on the waves and hardened by time, it is said, they were finally changed into rocks, which will always be called the Scironian rocks. If we wish to count over your exploits and also declare your age, your deeds would outnumber your years. For you, most valiant of heroes, we offer the thanks of our people, and yours is the health that we drink. The cheers of the crowd and the prayers of well-wishers resounded throughout the palace. There wasn't a corner of gloom in the whole of the city. And yet no pleasure is ever unmingled. Anxiety always intrudes upon joy. So Aegeus's delight in his son's return was marred by disquiet. King Minos of Crete was preparing for war. Though powerful on land and by sea, he was strong above all in the anger he felt as a father, in seeking a just revenge for Androgeos' murder at Athens. Moreover, he'd mustered his allies beforehand by scouring the sea, with the rapid fleet for which he was famous. Anaphe joined his cause, and the kingdom of Astapelea, the former induced by his pledges, the latter by force of arms. Low-lying Mykonos further off, Simolis renowned for its chalk, then Syros, the time-growing island, with low-hilled Seriphos. Paros, famed for its marble, and Siphnos, betrayed by the treacherous Arne, who, after receiving the gold she had greedily asked for, was changed to a bird, and even today retains her incurable passion for gold, as the black-footed, black-winged, pilfering jackdaw. But several islands, Olearos, Didyme, Tinos and Andros, Gyros, and the producer of olive oil, Peparethos, refused to support the navy from Crete. So Minos turned west and sailed to the island ruled by the Aeacid clan, Eunopeia. So the kingdom was called in ancient times, but Aegina was how King Aeacus liked to refer to it after his mother. A crowd flocked down to greet the arrival of Minos, longing to see such a famous person. The welcome party consisted of Aeacus' 3 sons, Telamon, Pelias, and Phocus, the youngest. Aeacus, too, although he was slow with the weight of his years, came out of the palace himself and inquired what Minos had come for. Reminded at once of the son he was mourning, the king of the 100 cities in Crete sighed deeply before he declared what he wanted. I ask for your help in a war of revenge for my murdered son. I beg you to join in my mission of duty to solace the buried. Aeacus answered, I have to refuse your request. Aegina may not be involved in your plan. No city is closer to Athens than we are. We could not betray the treaties of friendship between us. Minos sadly departed. Those treaties will cost you dear, he said to them, thinking it wiser to threaten the Aeginetans with war than to fight on the spot and waste his strength prematurely. The Cretan galleys were still in sight of Aegina's walls when a ship from Athens approached full sail and entered their allies' harbor. On board was Cephalus, bearing his country's commission. Though many years had elapsed since Aeacus' sons had set eyes on Cephalus' face, they knew him at once, and greeting him warmly, conducted him into their father's palace. The aged hero, whose handsome features preserved some marks of his youthful appearance, entered the royal palace, holding a branch of Athenian olive, and flanked to the right and the left by two of his younger compatriots, Clitus and Butes, whose noble father was Pallas. After the usual exchange of introductory greetings, the envoy delivered the message he'd brought from Aegeus in Athens, asking for help in the terms of the treaty between their two cities, and adding that Minos was aiming to conquer the whole of Greece. This appeal was made with persuasive eloquence. When it was ended, Aeacus answered, his left hand resting upon his scepter. Athens, you need not ask for our help. You have only to take it. Treat the strength of this island as yours without hesitation. Provided my present good fortune continues, and long may it do so, the power is there. I have soldiers in plenty, and, thanks to the gods, the time is propitious. I cannot for any good reason refuse you. I trust that is so, said the envoy. I pray for the growth of your city and people. Indeed, as I landed now, I was truly delighted when such a procession of handsome youths, all equal in age, came forward to meet me. However, I've noticed that many are missing from those whom I saw last time when I came as a guest to your city. Aeacus heaved a sigh and sadly explained what had happened. Earlier days of distress have been followed by happier times, and I only wish I could tell you the end without the beginning. But now I'll return to the start. No beating about the bush. The friends you remember and miss are nothing but bones and ashes, and they were only a fraction of what I lost when they perished. My people were struck by a terrible plague through the anger of cruel Juno, who hated the island that takes its name from her rival. So long as the illness seemed to be due to natural causes, and other reasons for such a disaster were not yet apparent, the battle against it was fought by our doctors. But all their skills were of no avail. The people died and they couldn't prevent it. In the beginning, the sky weighed down on the earth in a thick, black fog which trapped the prostrating heat in a blanket of clouds. And throughout the time that it took 4 moons to wax and to wane, the south winds blew with their sweltering currents of toxic air. All are agreed that the springs and the lakes were also infected, when thousands and thousands of slithering serpents infested the untilled fields and polluted the rivers and streams with additional poison. The dogs and the birds, the flocks and the herds, the beasts of the wild were the first to reveal the destructive power of the sudden disease. In blank amazement, the wretched farmers looked on, as their sturdy oxen collapsed at their plows and sank in the midst of the furrows. The woolly sheep were bleating away in sickly tones, when their fleeces fell off unshorn and their bodies wasted away. Horses once highly mettled, renowned for their speed on the racecourse, now brought shame on their former triumphs. Old prizes forgotten, they groaned in their stables, waiting to die in feeble inertia. The boar forgot he could ever be angry, the hind could no longer trust to her heels, and the bear was powerless to raid the cattle. Lethargy overtook all. The putrid carcasses lay in the forest, the fields and the roads, and the air grew foul with the stench. But, strange to tell, the dogs, the vultures, and grisly wolves wouldn't touch those infected bodies which decomposed into liquid, noxiously reeking and spreading contagion throughout the country. The plague grew stronger and next attacked the peasants and farmers. Then it proceeded to lord it inside the walls of the city. First a burning sensation inside the intestines, then flushes and short-drawn breathing were early symptoms of latent disorder. The tongue became rough and swollen, the lips were parted and dry from the winds, as the pestilent air was gulped in the gaping mouth. No one could bear to be covered with even the lightest of blankets. People would lie in the nude prostrate on the earth, and the soil never cooled them down but was warmed instead by the heat from their bodies. The virulent sickness was out of control, and even the doctors succumbed. Their skills, indeed, proved fatal to those who possessed them. The nearer a relative came to a patient, the more devoted his care, the sooner he died himself. When hope of recovery faded, and death was perceived as the only end to their illness, the sick would indulge their desires regardless of what might be best for them. Nothing, they knew, could do any good. All shame forsaken, they crowded the springs and the streams and clung to the sides of the wells. But before they could slake their thirst, their lives were quenched by their drinking. Some were too bloated to rise to their feet and were drowned in the stream that their tongues were lapping, though others still greedily went on drinking. Many poor sufferers couldn't endure their beds any longer and leapt to the floor, or, if they hadn't the strength to stand, they'd roll out of doors on the ground, and thus each person would flee from the hearth and home, which seemed to them now to be haunted by death. Not knowing the cause, they could only blame the house they had lived in. Some could be seen to be roaming the streets in a dazed condition, so long as their strength held up. If not, they'd be lying in tears flat on the ground, quite still but for rolling their sleepless eyes. Then, weakly extending their arms to the stars in the lowering heavens, here or there, wherever death took them, they gave up the ghost. How do you think I felt? What ought to have been my feelings but loathing for life, and a longing to join my people in death? Whichever direction I turned my gaze, my eyes were confronted by corpses, scattered like rotten apples fallen from shaken branches, or else like acorns under a wind-tossed oak tree. Look at that temple over there with its towering columns and lines of steps. That's Jupiter's temple. But who did not offer incense upon those altars in vain? How often the worshippers, saying their prayers, whether husbands for wives or fathers for children, ended their lives in front of the shrine with their prayers unanswered, and some of the incense still unused found clutched in their hands. How often a bull was brought to the temple, and while the priest was solemnly praying and pouring the wine libation between its horns, it slumped to the ground, unfelled by the axe it awaited. When I was sacrificing to Jove for myself, my country, and 3 sons, all of a sudden the victim moaned with a fearful bellow, and then collapsed of its own accord. When its throat was cut, the knife was merely stained with a feeble trickle. Entrails too were diseased and had lost the signs of the truth or divine admonition. The frightful plague had infected the vitals. I saw that corpses were strewn at the foot of the temple portals. People had hanged themselves outside in front of the altars to make their death more offensive. They'd banished the fear of death by inflicting death and inviting the fate which they knew was in store. Dead bodies no longer received the customary funeral rites. There wasn't room at the gates to take so many processions. Corpses were either exposed on the ground unburied or heaped on piers without any honors. Respect for the dead was forgotten. The living fought over the piers, the bodies were burning in flames intended for others. With no one left to weep for their loved ones, the souls of the old and the young, the spirits of husbands and children restlessly wandered in limbo, unsped by the rituals of mourning. No space was left for a tomb, no wood to allow a cremation. Aeacus next explained how sorrow had yielded to gladness. Overwhelmed by this powerful whirlwind of pain, I protested. Jupiter, hear me, Lord, if the story isn't a lie that you lay long ago in the arms of Asopus's daughter Aegina, if you, great father, are not ashamed to acknowledge your son, then either restore me, my people, or send me to my grave. The god gave a sign with a lightning flash and a peal of thunder. I welcome your omen, I duly exclaimed, and pray it betokens your goodwill. I take your response as a pledge of your favor. Nearby there happened to stand a magnificent spreading oak tree, sacred to Jove and sprung from the seed of an oak in Dodona. Here we saw a long column of ants which were gathering grain, all bearing their heavy loads in their tiny mouths and steadily trudging along their familiar path on the wrinkled tree bark. How many there are, I reflected in wonder and cried, O Father, of gods the most excellent, grant me as many subjects as these to replenish my empty walls. Then a noisy trembling came over the oak, though there wasn't a breath of wind to disturb the branches. My own limbs shuddered in quaking terror, my hair stood on end, yet I kissed the earth and the tree, not confessing my hopes to myself, though I dearly hoped and cherished my wish deep down in my heart. Night followed, when bodies worn out with care are taken over by sleep, and I dreamed a dream. Before me was standing the same oak, with all of its many branches and all those thousands of creatures crawling along them. I heard the noisy trembling again as the column of grain collectors was shaken down to the earth. The ants then suddenly grew, appearing larger and larger until they rose from the ground and stood with bodies erect. Their thinness was gone, they had only 2 feet, and their color no longer was black. Their limbs were completely changed into human form. Then I woke from my sleep, now conscious again. I cursed my dream and complained that the gods were of no help. But a deafening hubbub was echoing round the house, and I thought I could hear the unfamiliar sound of a human crowd. This must be part of my dream, I supposed, when Telamon opened the doors of my chamber and burst in, crying, Father, come out, for a sight you would never have hoped for, never believed. I followed him out, and there were the men who'd appeared to me in my dream, exactly the same as I'd seen them, down to their order of march, approaching to hail me as king. So, offering thanks to Jove for my newfound subjects, I gave them homes in the city and fields to be plowed where their previous owners had left them vacant. I called them Myrmidons after the ants they had come from. You've seen the bodies they now inhabit. They also preserve their original nature, a thrifty, industrious people who cling to their gains and store them away for the future. All of them young and brave, they'd follow you into the field as soon as the wind from the east, which happily brought you here, he was right, it was the east wind, is replaced by one from the south. Aeacus filled the length of the day in talking of these and other affairs with the envoy from Athens. The evening was given to feasting, the night to sleep. The following morning at sunrise, the wind was again in the east and staying the ships from their homeward voyage. So Clitus and Butes collected their older companion, Cephalus. Then the 3 of them made their way to the palace to find the king. But the king was in bed and not yet awake. They were met at the entrance by Phocus, one of the royal princes. His brothers, Pelias and Telamon, were choosing men for the army. Phocus led the Athenian guests to the inner courtyard, thence to a beautiful room, where they all sat down together. While they were talking, he noticed Cephalus holding a spear with a golden point, and made of an unfamiliar wood. So he interrupted the conversation to question the hero. I love the forests, he told him, and have a passion for hunting. I keep on wondering where the shaft of the spear you are carrying started its life. What wood was it cut from? It cannot be ash, as it isn't a pale gold color. And if it were cornel, it surely would have to be knotted. I've no idea where your javelin came from, but have to confess that I've never set eyes on a lovelier weapon. Clitus or Butes answered, You may be surprised by its beauty, but when you have learned how it's used, your surprise will be even greater. This spear never misses its target, its flight isn't subject to luck, and it comes back covered with blood with no one there to return it. This made young Phocus extremely eager to know the full story. why the spear had been given to Cephalus, where it had come from, and who had presented this wonderful gift. Then Cephalus answered the questions he put, though shame forbade him to mention the price he had paid. In tears of grief for the wife he had lost, he began, "Prince Phocus, son of a goddess, it's hard to believe, but this javelin is causing these tears of mine, and long will continue to cause them, if heaven decrees that I live much longer. This weapon destroyed my wife and destroyed me too. How I wish I had never possessed it. You've probably heard of Oreithyia, whom Boreas loved and abducted. Procris, my wife, was Oreithyia's sister. If you wish to compare the two for their beauty and disposition, she was the one to abduct. Our love, no less than her father Erechtheus, brought us together. They called me happy, and rightly. But heaven was jealous, or else I might be as happy today. A month had passed since our wedding day, and I was spreading my nets for the antlered deer, when over the top of Hymettus, the mountain always in flower, Aurora, the goddess of dawn, caught sight of me there in the saffron light of the morning and forced me away to the sky. Let me tell you the simple truth, without offense to the goddess. For all the charm of her blushing face, although she controls the frontiers of night and day, although she quaffs her juices of nectar, Procris remained my adored one. Procris was there in my heart, and the name of Procris was always upon my lips. I constantly spoke of our wedding rites, of the joys of love when a man and his bride are first united, our marriage so new and fresh, and now already forsaken. The goddess got angry and cried, "Stop moaning, you ungrateful man. You can keep your Procris, but I can foresee the future. You'll wish you had never possessed her." With that, she indignantly sent me packing. Journeying home, I pondered over Aurora's words and started to doubt. Had my wife been faithful during my absence? Her youth and her beauty suggested she might quite well have betrayed me. Her character told me she must be true. But nevertheless, I had been away for some time. Aurora herself was scarcely a model of chaste behavior, and anything frightens a lover. I therefore decided to look for a grievance and use inducements to shake my Procris's loyalty and virtue. Aurora encouraged my doubts and altered my features. I seemed to feel I was changing. And so I returned to the city of Athens without being recognized. Passing into my house, I found not a trace of scandal or misbehavior, only concern for the kidnapped master. 1,000 ruses could scarcely gain me access to Procris, and seeing her stunned me again, I almost abandoned my plan to test her fidelity, barely restraining myself from confessing the truth or kissing her on the lips as would have been proper. Sadness sat on her brow, though sadness became no woman better than her. She was pining in grief for the loss of her stolen husband. O Phocus, imagine what glorious beauty she had, when beauty shone out of her even in grief. I need not tell you how often her modest nature repulsed my attempts to seduce her. How often she said, "I am saving myself for one alone. Wherever he is, my joys are reserved entirely for him." What sane man wouldn't have felt that he'd tested his wife's fidelity far enough? But I couldn't be satisfied, only determined to wound myself. In return for a night, I promised a fortune, and then by more and more gifts I at last broke down her resistance. In wicked triumph I cried, "It is I, disguised as a lover, but truly your husband. I've caught you myself, you treacherous harlot." She said not a word. Just overcome by her unvoiced shame, she fled from her evil husband and left that house of entrapment. Resentment against me made her detest all men, and she wandered over the mountains, engaged in the chase pursuits of Diana. I was alone, and the flames of my love burned even more fiercely inside my heart. I implored her forgiveness, confessed I had wronged her, and said that I too could well have succumbed to a like temptation, if I had ever been offered such hugely extravagant gifts. When I'd made this confession, she felt she had punished the slight to her honor. I won her back, and we passed the years in peace and delight. As though the gift of herself were too little, she made me a further present, a dog she'd received from her patron goddess Diana, who'd spoken these words, No dog will ever run faster than this one. My dear wife also gave me the javelin you see in my hands. Would you like me to tell you about the fate of my earlier present? Listen, the story's a strange one. You'll find it very surprising. Oedipus, son of Laius, had solved the riddle which baffled the brains of others before him. The Sphinx was defeated, and lying toppled beneath the cliff, her own dark secrets forgotten. At once a second monster, a giant vixen, was sent to ravage Boeotian Thebes, and many country folk feared for their lives, and the lives of their flocks and herds. The men in the district joined me in forming a cordon extending all round the plain. But the great fox swiftly surmounted our nets with the lightest of leaps, bounding over the line at the top of the trap we had laid. Our hounds were at once unleashed, but the vixen evaded pursuit and cheated the pack by running as fast as a bird can fly. Then all the hunters loudly appealed to me for my whirlwind. That was the name of my dog. He had long been struggling like fury to slip his own leash and straining against his constricting collar. The hound was released, and at once we had no idea where he was. His footprint showed in the baking sand, but Whirlwind himself had vanished, gone with the speed of a spear, or of bullets hurled from a whirling sling, or an arrow shot from a Cretan bow. I climbed to the peak of a hill overlooking the country all round, and so obtained an excellent view of a new kind of chase, in which the vixen one moment appeared to be caught, but the next to escape from the hound's very jaws. The crafty creature refused to run in a line straight ahead, but eluded the fangs at her tail by circling around and denying her foe the use of his spring. But the dog kept close on his quarry's heels, and yes, he had got her. But no, he had not. He was only snapping at empty air. I turned to my javelin for help, and while I was poising it over my shoulder and trying to slip my fingers inside the thong, I looked away for a moment and then looked back to the same place. There, in the midst of the plain, I saw with surprise two figures in marble. You'd guess that one was in flight while the other was barking. I suppose, if a god was there with the runners, he must have decided that neither should win that astonishing race and neither be beaten. Here Cephalus paused and was silent. Then Phocus said, Now for your javelin, what was the crime it committed? And Cephalus told him the story. In my case, Phocus, joy was the first beginning of sorrow. I'll tell you at once of my joy. O Phocus, I love to remember that blessed time, those early years of our married life, when I was so happy with Procris and she was happy with me. We were truly together. We loved and looked after each other so fondly. In her eyes, Jove could never have made such a wonderful lover, and I could not have been drawn to a woman other than Procris, not Venus herself. Our hearts were on fire with the passion we shared. When the sun god's earliest rays were striking the mountain peaks, I'd venture outdoors to hunt in the woods, as a young man will. No attendants, horses, or keen-nosed hounds would be keeping me company. I never bothered with knotted nets, but relied on my spear. When my arm was weary with slaughtering beasts, I'd return to the cool shade, wooing the breeze which rose from the chillier valleys below. The gentle breeze in the noonday heat was all that I wanted, all I was waiting for, all that I needed to ease my tiredness. Come to me, beautiful breeze, steal into my breast, you're so lovely, this heat is burning me up, relieve me, I beg you, as only you can. My fate was leading me on, and I might perhaps have continued with further endearments. Perhaps I would say, You give me such pleasure, O breeze, your refreshing caress, it's for you that I worship the forest and lonely places, yours is the breath that I'm always longing to catch in my lips. Some eavesdropper heard these equivocal words and misunderstood what they meant. The breeze that I called to so often, he thought was the name of a nymph with whom I must be in love. At once, without thinking, he went to my wife to report this imagined affair and repeat in a whisper the words he had overheard. Love is a credulous thing. As I learned later on, poor Procris collapsed and fell to the ground in shock. When at last she revived, she declared how wretched she was, how cruelly fate had treated her. I had been so unfaithful. The charge against me was groundless. Her fears were inspired by nothing, only the ghost of a name. But she suffered, poor woman, as though I were keeping a genuine mistress. Yet often she felt uncertain and desperately hoped she'd be proved mistaken. It couldn't be true, she said, unless she caught me red-handed. She would never find her husband guilty of falsehood. The following morning, when saffron Aurora had banished the night, I left for the forest as usual, and, after a fruitful hunt, stretched out on the grass. "Now come to me, breeze," I chanted. "Soothe me and cure my weariness." Suddenly, while I was speaking, I thought that I heard a moan. "Come, beautiful breeze," I continued. Another disturbance, this time the rustle of fallen leaves. A beast on the prowl, I decided, and sent my javelin flying. Procris was there under cover, and clutching her wounded breast, cried out in her pain. When I recognized the voice of my faithful wife, my own wife, I rushed like a madman towards the sound. I found her dying, her clothes all stained and spattered with blood. She was trying to draw from her wound, alas, her own dear present to me. I tenderly lifted her body towards me, the body dearer to me than my own. Then tearing her dress from her bosom, I bound her wound and attempted to staunch the flow of her blood, while I begged her not to desert me, defiled by the guilt of her death. Though her strength was failing, she forced herself to murmur this much with her dying breath. "I implore you now, by the vows of our marriage, by all the gods of the sky, and the gods where soon I shall be, by any kindness I have shown you, and by our love which continues even now when I'm dying, although it has caused my death, please never allow your breeze to take my place as your wife." As she spoke, I at last understood that a name had caused this confusion and told her the truth. But what was the use of her learning the truth? She sank in my arms, and her last faint strength ebbed out with her blood. And while she was able to see, her eyes were on mine, and mine were the lips which caught her breath as the poor soul breathed her last. But the look on her face was enough to show me she died in peace. The hero ended. His audience, like him, was in tears. Then Aeacus came on the scene with a pair of his sons and a party of fresh-raised soldiers. Cephalus quickly took charge of the armed contingent.